Welcome to the Judgment Call podcast, a podcast where I bring together some of the most curious minds on the planet. Risk takers, adventurers, travelers, investors, entrepreneurs, and simply mind-bogglers. To find all episodes of this show, simply go to Spotify, iTunes, or YouTube, or go to our website, judgmentcallpodcast.com. If you like this show, please consider leaving a review on iTunes or subscribe to us on YouTube. This episode of the Judgment Call podcast is sponsored by Mighty Travels Premium. Full disclosure, this is my business. What we do at Mighty Travels Premium is to find the airfare deals that you really want. Thousands of subscribers have saved up to 95% in their airfare. Those include $150 round-trip tickets to Hawaii from many cities in the US, or $600 lie-flat tickets in business class from the US to Asia, or $100 business class lie-flat tickets from Africa round-trip all the way to Asia. In case you didn't know, about half the world is open for business again and accepts travelers. Most of those countries are in South America, Africa, and Eastern Europe. To try out Mighty Travels Premium, go to mightytravels.com/MTP, or if that's too many letters for you, simply go to MTP, the number 4, and the letter U.com to sign up for your 30-day free trial.
Important points. I am not at all in the camp of the neo-Luddites or the people who are really concerned that technology is depriving us of our humanity. Quite the contrary. I think that technology really reveals a lot about our humanity, reveals things that we didn't realize, sometimes reveals unpleasant things about ourselves. For example, social media, how they highlight bullying, how they highlight extremism. And the reason is that the people who run the sites have discovered that anger is the most powerful way to get people to pay more attention to the site, and to sell that lets them sell more advertising. And so you have a bias toward real but and unpleasant but partial sides of humanity. It's the technology that brings them out, but the technology didn't create them. The technology didn't create bullying. The technology didn't create hatred, but it does seem to mobilize people that way. And I have a phrase that I haven't yet used in print, so I'll introduce it here. We were expecting the information age, but instead we have the inflammation age. We have because enragement creates engagement. That could be the motto of social media.
Yeah, I like this line.
Get people angry. Get people arguing with each other. Get people to join in the hatred of comments, and it doesn't matter what the content is. People will just jump in and they'll denounce each other, and meanwhile you're sitting back and counting the money as they fight among each other. There's a friend of mine who published a paper recently in Computing and Law Journal about the status of the social media contracts under Anglo-American common law. And he believes that they're unconscionable, that they're void. And this has not yet, by the way, been contested in a court. So somebody could bring a suit and say that the end user agreement of Facebook or whatever is unconscionable. Now, I have no idea of what judges would say about that, but my friend is a retired partner in one of the largest law firms in the world. He is a visiting professor at the University of Chicago. He lectures to students in China, so he's not a marginal figure in the legal world. And I don't really agree with him on the unconscionability part, but I think that he's been really tremendously devoted to that, and I give him credit for that. So we'll see whether any influential journalist picks up on that. and his name is Preston Torbert, by the way. So anybody who is interested can just Google his name, Torbert, and it was published in a journal. I forget the exact name, but a journal of technology and law. My view is that technology really freed me to pursue my writing. Technology in the form of word processing and in the form of databases was what really gave me a second life as a writer and scholar. I was always somebody who revised a lot. I remember in college, I would make one draft after another. I would type it on the typewriter, I would read it, and I would say, no, this isn't right. So I would type the whole paper again. And for someone who works like that, even the simplest word processing program running on a TRS-80 was a revelation. And while holding down a demanding job as a science acquisition editor, one of the most competitive jobs in publishing, I was able in my own time to resume the kind of writing that I had done as an undergraduate, and to publish my first book. And ultimately, the writing took over from the editing, and I had done what I had set out to do, publishing other people's work, and now it was time for me to pay attention to my own. And all of that was really made possible by the early availability of databases like LexisNexis at Princeton University. And others, so I could look through historical newspapers. I could look through the back issues of magazines. A lot of things that had taken much more time in printed reference books could now be done almost instantaneously. And I have been working on that ever since, and developing new techniques for mining the human record as recorded in these databases.
Yeah, I was really excited to have you on, Edward. You are such a intricate student of history and the history of technology, and you're a master by now. You're not a student anymore, but I think we're all students going through life. And you have really become famous for figuring out, and you mentioned some already, these hidden consequences of technology. So we started technology. We don't know what we take out of this urn, so to speak, right? It's a new innovation. We don't know what it actually does, what it will do to us. We introduce us, and we often have the best intentions. We want to make money from it. We want to build an ecosystem around us. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs think they make the world a better place. And often it does. But sometimes we, in the process, change things that we didn't expect. And I love how you made the example with Facebook. We can have ascribe bad intentions to Facebook, but how I experienced the industry here in Silicon Valley in the early 2000s and after, Facebook was just a company who wanted attention, right? They wanted to have other people use their product. And the way they designed this engagement algorithm was the only thing they could measure. They could only measure certain clicks, how long you look at something. And these basic limbic brain emotions turn out to be the things they could measure. The more difficult ones, if we like something, if it's scientific, that the engagement algorithm couldn't track this. And then suddenly in 2014, 2015, we all became, sucked into this algorithm. We all just became slaves to it, and the whole world changed, and we turned against each other. And I think that's still going on, right? And I don't think it was ever Facebook's goal.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. And I don't think they're probably very comfortable about it, but it's very difficult for them to change now, because there isn't any alternative model that would let them make as much money or nearly as much money doing things on the positive side. Another really interesting unintended consequence, though, was Google, and the Google algorithm is one of the most fascinating things that I've studied, because it really started out not as a commercial project, but as a theoretical academic curiosity, a patented one, of course. And the founders of Google actually at one point offered to sell the company to Yahoo for $1 million.
Yeah.
And even in 2002, I was at a scenario planning workshop for the Library of Congress at the Claremont Resort in Oakland. And there were all kinds of people from industries. The technology vice president of Sony, for example, was there. Stuart Brand from the Whole Earth catalog is one of the people conducting this. And one of the fascinating things looking back is how people saw that Google was providing a really valuable service, but they didn't see how it would ever be sustainable. And at one point, a participant, when we were talking about possible scenarios, one participant said, "Well, maybe the government will have to take over Google," and now it's more likely the other way around. But that was that was the sentiment in
Yeah.
in 2002, and so the way in which that mutated and Google became something very different, the greatest advertising agency in history. That was something that nobody inside or outside the industry was forecasting in 2002.
Yeah.
And even in 2005, when I started to write a column for the Technology Review, which had just been taken over by Jason Ponton as editor, the cover of that relaunch issue was Google, and then there was a kind of a graphic play on words like God, but for how long? In other words, Google was making this splash with their IPO, but it was still not clear whether they would really become a giant company or stay a giant company. And one of the things that I like about technology actually is how unpredictable it is, because sometimes the unpredictable things are among the most positive ones. Sometimes the discoveries that take place as a result of disasters even show us the way to improvements, and we might not have taken those paths if there hadn't been some failures. So I am not a partisan of the precautionary principle, because the precautionary principle, if you really apply it rigorously, would condemn us to a lot of the unintended consequences that already exist and keep us from exploring new things. I think the secret, and one of the things that is a theme in my work, is that instead of trying to eliminate all negative unintended consequences, the real challenge is to limit them, to experiment, but to know when to quit, not to do things in a way that will be irreversible. And a lot of the worst things are actually those that run away before people realize what was happening. For example, many of these invasive species that I wrote about in Why Things Bite Back were originally introduced by experts. But the experts, instead of being cautious about them, oversold them, and they treated them as miracle organisms that would create incredible industries. And then when they ran wild, they said, well, we couldn't have foreseen this, and in a way they couldn't, but they could also have acted initially with much more caution.
Yeah. It seems technology and the way it interacts with us, there's just too many variables to really usefully predict it. And, in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of venture capitalists. That's basically all they do is predict the future and bet on it. And it seems incredibly hard to get all these variables under control. Like, even if a technology comes out and works and is working exactly like we predicted a couple of years earlier, it seems like the technology adoption is a big question. And then on the other hand, also, will it ever be cheap enough? And I remember that example with the steam engine. I don't know if you probably looked at this, how long it was around, and nobody really was too interested in it until someone, and I think it was James Watts, but correct me if that's wrong, he made it so easy to use that it becomes something you can apply to lots of different functions. But the steam engine maybe could have been invented by the Romans, but maybe they would have never had a real use case for it.
There is a paper that I cite in Our Own Devices. It was written by a British classicist named Horsfall, Horsfall, and it's called Rome Without Spectacles. And it was about why the Romans, who had the optical technology and science and skill with glass to create eyeglasses, never made eyeglasses. And the reason that he gave was not a technological but a social one, that wealthy Romans had slaves to read to them. There were literate Greek slaves who would who served as secretaries and who could just recite books when their masters were no longer able to read them. And this was true of a lot of other Roman technologies. For example, the Romans had a wonderful skill in casting bronze letters. And they also had extremely effective presses that they used for processing cloth. One of them is very well preserved in Herculaneum, the great archaeological site. But they never invented printing. The Romans could have invented printing from movable type. And the reason for that, again, was in the nature of Roman society. To be a literate Roman meant to read elegantly from scrolls, and part of your prestige as a literate Roman was to be able to get up before your guests and read poetry and manipulate the scrolls with skill. So this was as much a feature as a bug at the time. It was that literacy was something that was really part of an elite skill set. And one of the contributions of Christianity was democratizing reading. And it was actually Ethiopian Christians who introduced the Codex, the book, the common book that nearly everybody has now, and there are only a few faiths, Judaism and some others that preserve their scriptures in scrolls. But the idea behind the Codex was that it was relatively cheap and compact. It was easy to store, and it became a tremendous success. The Romans also, the Christian, the monasteries in the Middle Ages also introduced the idea of space between words. In antiquity, in Greece and Rome, there were no spaces between words. You were supposed to be able, again, reading from a scroll, you were supposed to be able to break down the words fluently. That was part of your skill as a literate person. But in the early Christian world, it was important to educate young men for the priesthood and other clerical responsibilities. So you needed a kind of writing that was easier for beginners. And this was the origin of books as we know them.
This is so fascinating.
It was a social innovation. It was a social innovation. So a lot of what we think of as purely technological really turns out to be social. Let me give you another example.
Yeah.
I'm often disturbed by people following me too close on the road. The technology exists so that nearly every car could be equipped with a signal that you're following too close. And it might even be equipped with a chip that would prevent you from following too close. This would be an easy thing. But people have an idea of their autonomy on the road, and they don't like their freedom to tailgate and be involved in accidents to be limited. So many things that would be beneficial and actually minimally invasive and annoying. It wouldn't have to be a buzzer. It could just be a light that came on your dashboard. Many things that would be very simple to introduce are not used. And on the other hand, there are all kinds of really, really complicated things of doubtful use that are there because people in marketing believe that these will be selling points for the cars, even though in use the actual benefits will be doubtful. I saw that myself when I bought a home theater AV receiver. I had been looking for this for quite a while. My old television, which was 20 years old, the CRT had failed, and I bought a new 4K television, and I was looking for something to power it with center channel and all of that. So I paid more than I had expected to, but I thought at least I'm going to have a state-of-the-art units, and it had Dolby this and Dolby that. It supported speakers not only on the sides but in the ceiling behind you, and it had Netflix. It had a half dozen other streaming services. The only thing it couldn't do was to pair with my television set. And I spent hours on the phone with the retailer, with the manufacturer of the television. I wasn't able to reach the manufacturer of the receiver, and I had to send it back. So the priorities very often in industry is in proliferating features that people use to sell these, and people think, well, the more features it has, the better it is, and yet they can thereby skimp on things that are much more basic and important.
Yeah, it seems there is this one time stream of technological progress that's mostly in engineering, science progress, and then we have this whole different time stream that is sociological, where we see the readiness to adopt new technology, take advantage of it, or maybe not. There is always cultures, and it's very often hard to tell. Are you in an age right now where you are appreciating this technology, where you're hungry for it, you would love to introduce and you do whatever you can, or you live in a time where you feel these innovations just create too much trouble, so let's stay away from them and they will die out, right? So there's no entrepreneur can survive. There was this, I don't know who said it initially, you don't want to be as an entrepreneur somewhere where you're tolerated, you want to be somewhere where you're celebrated. And if it's just tolerated, then these things will never take off and your business won't go anywhere, because you need an amazing amount of support, basically this wave that comes into the harbor and supports you.
Yeah.
When you look at influences, how society changed over time in order to be more open to this, or maybe not, for good reasons, where are these trigger points? Do you feel religion is a big impact? Do you feel it is something that is more random? What can we use to predict if we, let's say, the next 50 years or the next 100 years will be more or less open?
It's almost impossible to predict 50 years ahead. I have studied the history of futurism, and
that's an oxymoron, is it?
Well, no, it's actually virtually a discipline. I've written at least 3 or 4 essays about futurists and futurism, and the specialist consultants who call themselves not necessarily futurists, but they investigate scenarios. So the real futurists are not the people who are quoted in the popular press and saying in 25 years we will all do this or do that, but they're people who advise corporations on possibilities for the future. One of them being a pandemic, for example, that was very often mentioned. The problem with that kind of futurism, though, is that while quite a few people predicted a global pandemic, they really didn't anticipate the specific features that have made COVID-19 such a tragic event. That is the spread by asymptomatic people, for example. I looked back at the people who were saying, "Watch out, a pandemic is coming," and for example, they predicted that the United States would do very well, but third world countries would really bear the brunt of it, and to some extent that is true. That when you read about the rates of infection in India and Brazil, but there are other countries in the developing world that have had relatively low rates, and there are so many surprises in the nature of the virus and how it spreads. Remember, in the early days, people were underestimating the aerosol factor, and they were fixating on surfaces. So even now, if you return a library book in my community, it will stay in a special place for disinfection for a couple of days before it goes back on the shelf, even though there is no evidence of anybody anywhere getting a case of coronavirus from a library book. But it's something that has this symbolic value. So what happens is that even though people may predict some very important features, what happens is that the prediction is just partial. When you look more closely, there were other things that they didn't predict that really affect the outcome, and that make the really reduce the value of the prediction.
One of the things you mentioned in your books is the role of information overload. So we have that crazy amount of information that we can access within a heartbeat's time, but it didn't, at least until now, when we say the timeline was somewhere in the 90s when the internet really took off. But we always, that the books before that, the printing press, they were all devices that gave us access to more information. Why don't we see that impact on productivity growth in a positive way from this information overload that we especially enjoy in the last 30 years?
Well, there are a couple of sides to that question. One is that historians who have looked at the fear of information overload have found instances that go back at least to the 18th century, and you can find some examples in the 17th century. There are so many books, it's impossible to know all of it. It's impossible to read them all. And then in the 19th century, I discovered that at the peak of popular education in Europe, when the school systems were being built out, when more and more students were pursuing secondary school and university studies, when the number of printed books was multiplying, new university programs were starting, people were really concerned that everybody was turning into bookworms, and that they were, for example, that they were ruining their eyes. So one of the lasting results of that was the architecture of many schoolrooms with tall windows, and that was the result of studies that I related in my chapter in Our Own Devices on eyeglasses, how leading ophthalmologists were so concerned that students were weakening their eyes by reading too much. So the kind of overload of the number of publications has to be qualified in some ways. And one way to qualify that is to say that the consequence of that in part has been the development of increasing specialization. So there were always more books, for example, on the French Revolution and source materials than any one person would be able to master. But the way that academia grew was that there were other people then who started to study the revolutions of 1830, which I did for my dissertation, and other people who study the revolutions of 1848 and the Paris Commune. So and then there were all kinds of methodological new disciplines. There was women's studies, African American studies. These overlapped with existing fields. So what I think happens in academia, from what I've seen, is that as knowledge grows, specialties also develop, and so there may even be an iron law that everybody's professional fate in science and scholarship depends on about 50 colleagues. There are about 50 people, no matter how many, no matter how much higher education goes, there are 50 people who have something like your specialty. 50 people who are possible reviewers for your book. 50 people who might be writing letters to your dean about whether you are the most qualified person for this job, or to somebody else's dean if you're applying for another job. So I think that although there is this proliferation of knowledge, you could measure it by the number of books in the Library of Congress, or the number of terabytes that are available in various texts on the web. There is also an adaptation in society that actually blunts this effect. By the way, except for people like me who try to get into too many things.
Yeah, like in AGI, this is maybe the argument why we won't see an artificial general intelligence anytime soon, because it's just so much information. But I like the way you put this. So if we feel we have to go into a stronger specialization, which I think pretty much everyone agrees right now, there's very few contrarians who say that's not the case. We change our economy in becoming more creative and more specialized, but we work together easier because collaboration has gotten easier. We can do this worldwide. This in turn will lead to more information overload, because we can afford more information, or because we need it, right? Because each field kind of produces their own body of knowledge.
Yes,
and it needs to be ignored by everyone else in order to make sense.
Yes, and there are also institutions for dealing with it. For example, there are many more meta-analyses of research being published. And there is also text and data mining, and one of the big issues is like the copyright status of databases. Do you have the right commercially to mine them, or is that a separate right? So the proliferation of information brings with it all kinds of social and institutional and legal issues and consequences, but we have managed through all of these to keep this explosion under control.
Yeah, I guess the modern equivalent of this is, instead of reading a book, you read the headline of an abstract that talks about the book on Twitter. So I mean, it was definitely, and one it's a sentence that sticks with you, but you can keep thousands of people. You can maybe remember, if you have a good memory. I don't. A few thousand of such annotations, so you know what this person stands for, right? This is what we have, which is quite a skill, right? It's great, because when you need that person, you can reach out to that person or research more.
Yes. Well, I have a personal database of many gigabytes, consisting of downloaded articles to which I assign my own metadata. And I will very often, I can't read more than a small fraction of the books that I see reviewed and look interesting, but I will make a note for future times when I might be writing about this topic, that here was a book that appeared in 2016 that was well reviewed and is a good introduction to this subject. So I can't read these books as they're appearing, but I can get an overview of what's out there. And so when it comes time for me to write about it, I know where to look. And this is a skill that I developed as a science editor. As a science editor, I had to follow a lot of research in many fields when I was the only science editor. And so I learned how to read the literature in a certain way, to identify the personalities who seemed most promising as book authors, who were not necessarily always the most acclaimed people as researchers. Some of them were, but very often they were people who were not famous for original contributions, but had a very elegant and original way of looking at things.
Yeah, one of the people you wrote about, I guess you admire him too, is Richard Feynman, one of the most gifted scientists that we've ever had. When you look at Richard Feynman and his genius, what do you think he would do today? What would he tell us today if he would be alive?
Oh, that's a challenging question. I published Feynman's last scientific book, QED, and I was able to do that because I had a very primitive but effective intelligence service in the form of subscribing to the printed announcements of lectures at colleges and universities around the United States. And so I saw a UCLA bulletin, again delivered in the US mail before the web, that Richard Feynman was going to be giving a series of lectures. And I knew that Feynman's regular publisher was Norton, but I thought, well, and also that the University of California Press might be the publisher, which often happens when people have given a series of lectures. But I thought it couldn't hurt for me to ask, and so I got in touch with, not with Feynman directly, but with the dean who sponsored this new endowed lecture series. And what he told me was that the lectures existed only as videos, and that the book was that it was available. He didn't mention this, but Norton was not able to work with the transcript of the videos, and neither, I learned later, was the University of California Press. So the question is, how do you edit? How do you edit Feynman? You really needed somebody who could work with him. But how do you find someone? And it turns out there was an absolutely obvious choice, because the son of Feynman's collaborator on the Feynman lectures in physics, the one who edited them, was also a friend of Feynman's, and so he was a perfect person to work with Feynman and to turn the video lectures into a book, and the book sold 500,000 copies. So when that happened, I had mixed feelings. I was very happy that we got the book and that it did so well, but I also realized that I was not going to get any more books from Feynman, because sadly Feynman was dead by the time the book appeared. That was his last scientific book, and I think that was a turning point for me in 1986, 5 years before I left publishing. That said, well, I've done what I set out to do. I always wanted to publish Feynman, and now it's time for me to turn to something else and turn to my own work. Now, as far as what Feynman would say, um, uh, I think Feynman had such an elegant way of looking at things that unfortunately, in order for somebody to say what Feynman would have said, they would have to be uh, almost another Feynman, and we don't have anyone. We don't have anyone like that now. But I think he had a really this wonderful direct intuition about things that very few other people have had.
Yeah. One of the things we seem to have abandoned, and you wrote about those plenty, are the heroic projects, like the Panama Canal, the Suez Canal,
Yes.
The Orion spacecraft,
Yes.
which very few people know about, the just going to the moon, Sputnik,
Yes.
all these things that seem to be common sense in certain time periods, 60s, 30s, and then in the 1900s. will we ever have them back, or do we have them? Our eyes are not open to them.
That's something I've thought about a lot. A friend of mine, Frank Davidson, was the president of something called the Macro Engineering Society, and he was a backer of and student of big projects. His brother, whom I met in Paris, was the lawyer for the Channel Tunnel project. So the Channel Tunnel may have been the last of the heroic infrastructure projects of that kind, and of course, financing is a huge part of it. A number of things I think are involved in that, and the first is that so many of these projects were undertaken without realizing how difficult they were going to be. And when I was at the Institute for Advanced Study, I knew a great economist who Albert Hirschman, who had a phrase called the hiding hand, not the invisible hand, but the hiding hand. By the hiding hand, he meant that if people knew how hard many enterprises were going to be, they wouldn't have started.
Yeah.
But because they were ignorant, they went ahead and they found the means to realize what they were doing. That this was something like what happened with the Panama Canal, for which I wrote a piece for the NEH magazine. So once it gets started, then human resourcefulness steps in, but sometimes it doesn't. The first Panama Canal company failed, so you really almost needed one company to fail for somebody else to take that up. So I think that one of the things that's happened maybe is that there's a different attitude, and people are now much more rational about their calculations. That so many of those things required a certain kind of romanticism that maybe as a result of technology and the ability to project costs more accurately, we are not able to delude ourselves into big things that possibly could turn out to be extremely productive. There is
But aren't these
also, I'm sorry.
projects typically long-term productive? Like in the short term, maybe they're a nightmare, right? Like the Channel project. But in the long term, are there so many that we maybe don't remember that are not productive? They all seem crazy productive to me.
Well, we forget about the ones that didn't work out,
True.
and I wrote a review of a book called "The Shock of the Old" about the prevalence of old technologies by a British military historian named David Edgerton. And one of the things I pointed out was the number of fundamental inventions that would seem to be about to transform life. For example, high temperature superconductivity was going to revolutionize power transmission. I remember that from the late 80s. And I was at a physics meeting where that was announced, and everybody was really over the moon about the possibilities. And yet it turned out that there were lots of technical problems. So far, who knows, in the future they may be realized, but so far they haven't done what people expected. Magnetic levitation trains, the latest trains that we've seen are really on the conventional flanged wheel on steel rail. Now, incrementally, we have much better alloys for the wheels. We have all kinds of improvements in the rails. We have sensors that will detect failing rails. At one point, you needed track walkers. The American railroads had hundreds, maybe thousands of men who walked along every yard of track and inspected it visually. And then there were cars that came along, special rail cars with measuring instruments that could do that electronically. So we've automated a lot, and yet the basic principle of the flanged wheel on the steel rail has remained the same, because the more radical things really were not able to compete with it.
You wrote about the other extreme maybe it's not really an extreme, quite a bit. It's this American pragmatism. It's this forward-looking, self-fulfilling, positive prophecy. It's this almost. I kind of trace it back sometimes to the Old Testament, but it's something that the New Testament has as well. There's a reason we had the Mayflower, and the reason we had the New Haven when the first settlers came over. Is that something where you feel we've lost that a little bit since we divided ourselves from religion even more than it was 100 years ago? Or do you feel we're still seeing this as a core value that really makes America stand out?
Well, I think pragmatism is still a big feature of American life, although it has been eroded somewhat by the I think to some extent artificial polarization that we have. I say artificial polarization because if we had a multi-party system, there would not be the same level of acrimony. The multi-party system plus the primaries gives a disproportionate weight to people who are the most passionate on each side, and so it sometimes results in outcomes that really go against what the majority what the majority believe. In European systems, there are other problems. There are problems forming coalitions. So I'm not saying it's utopian, but the advantage is that you don't get the same degree of extreme polarization. You certainly have some. And one of the ironies, now we're coming to social unintended consequences, is that the primary elections, which were supported by progressives as a way to bring power to the people away from party bosses, have actually given power to the people, but very often to the people who are most passionate and extreme in their views, and so it's unlikely, for example, that in the absence of primaries, that Donald Trump would have been elected president, or that he would have such strong support as he has now. But as long as there are so many people who passionately believe in a candidate, it is very, very hard for people to oppose them, because primary has become a verb that people are threatened with being primaried. So to me, that's a really good illustration of how a well-intentioned reform in the long run can turn against the very people who originally proposed it.
Yeah, I mean, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah, yeah.
And I grew up in Eastern Germany, and I feel that's what I learned from my parents, who really believed in the socialist utopia, is that they had a lot of positive intentions, and they kind of were true believers all the way to the end. They kind of still are to an extent. And it is something that was clearly not going to work economically, at least. You could see that in the early 70s. And it was only a small part of the population that was still hanging on to this. And we saw this in the late 80s, when suddenly in a small country of 17 million, 13 million were on the street, just like that. Nobody today, tomorrow 13 million are on the street, and let's change this, right? So there is this odd balancing between, and I think the socialism experiment showed us this really nicely, which let's give them the credit and the benefit of the doubt that this is a positive intention of a utopia. But somewhat this utopia doesn't arrive, and it very quickly turned into a nightmare. This balancing out, and I think we all have this, right? We say, someone says something that seems like a positive intention, but do we know if this is the real intention? We do not, right? So we need to take people not just at their word, but at their actions over time. And these things need to play out. And I feel the extremism we see in the US is maybe good, because it shows us all the possible scenarios on the sides. And usually we get scared and we come back to the middle. That doesn't really happen in Europe so much. Their system is more based on not having a very open discussion, of coming together quicker. Yeah. But then it's leaving and alienating big parts of society that never have a say. They never get their moment in prime light. which happens in the US, right? We go crazy before the elections, and then 6 months later we forget about it.
Yeah, no,
At least most of the time.
I agree. I agree completely. And I was just reading in Financial Times about Wirecard and the crisis of the German, the German government's involvement in it. So there are some Americans think of Europe as a kind of utopia of rational people who are totally honest and transparent, and to me that's just a mirage. What I have been studying, I'm beginning to write an essay about this, is the history of 5-year plans.
That's a good one. Yeah.
I haven't studied that in the GDR so far, but the reason was that China has just announced its 14th 5-year plan, but the 5-year plans have been a little less popular as such. But there were two interesting things that I found about 5-year plans so far. One is that the 5-year plan after the Second World War was actually adopted not only by France and other Western nations, but by many American corporations. So it was one of those cases in which a communist innovation helped take over, for at least for a time, capitalism. But there was another thing too, and that is that one of the great anti-communist books of all times was Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. And some people might think that The Road to Serfdom is about the gulag, about the confiscation of property, suppression of liberties, and Hayek certainly dwells on those things. But the interesting thing was that his attack was really on planning and the idea of a planned society and a planned economy, something that he found also in fascist countries. And the point that Hayek was making was that the chaos and uncertainty of a liberal society was really necessary because no planner could really foresee all of the complications that arise in reality. And therefore, it is better that enterprises and maybe people should fail than a government that tries to think of itself as all wise should try to plan everything, which he argued was what led to tyranny. And he had a wonderful phrase for that. He said that the ultimate backing of capitalism, of a liberal society, is the bailiff. The ultimate backing of communism is the hangman. So it was but on the other hand, there was one of the reasons he wrote that was in the 1930s, there was tremendous prestige in planning and a view of many idealistic young people in America and elsewhere that in the midst of this terrible unemployment in Western countries, the Soviets, through their 5-year plans, were really getting things right. Nobody was unemployed. Businesses were not failing. Everything was allocated. Everything was fair and so forth. And I could see how, to somebody confronted with the chaos of capitalism during the 30s, that was so appealing. And many of these people, of course, later in the 1950s turned against communism. There was that famous book, The God That Failed. But the appeal, I think, was based on a flawed perception, but in a way, it was correct in the sense that there was no unemployment, that people might have to accept the job that was given them, but that jobs could always be created to keep people from being classified as unemployed. I visited East Berlin once when I was a day student in Heidelberg in the in 1968-69. We had there was a conference there, and so I was able to, I crossed over at Checkpoint Charlie and changed some money and visited a few museums, but it seemed to be it was a weird. Berlin there was a kind of weird society because everybody looked so. They were not, their body language was different. They were just kind of going as though they were going to some appointment. It wasn't what this kind of street traffic that you would see in West Berlin. And I've always wondered whether that was just Berlin or whether my presence as an obvious American or West, non GDR citizen was what made people avoid me. But it was an interesting experience.
Well, they say communism robs you of your personality because you become this cog in the machine. You're not made in the image of God. You're made in the image of man, and what that means is really this shrinking down to this is your position, and it's being defined not by God but by someone who basically puts you there, right? So it's not even your parents. It's typically part of this bureaucracy that was built in these communist countries, and that you don't have any unalienable rights. They don't exist, and for that reason you kind of avoid any communication, you avoid any confrontation, you avoid anything that isn't efficient, so to speak. Obviously that appeals to Germans, right? So they love this. And so the efficiency idea that you can be more efficient when you plan, I think that's a given. It is true, right? It's this trial and error, this constant producing stuff in excess and doing it in thousands of ways that are wrong seems ridiculous. And it kind of is, but only in a 5-year perspective or in a 1-year perspective, whatever their short time frame is. Then planning and executing on a good plan is way better. It's like a company, right? Once you have your product and your market fit, you're good to go. But then 5 years later, things have changed, or 6 months later, you need to readjust, and then that's when you get killed all the time.
Yeah.
And every company learns this sooner or later that they need to readjust. And these countries, for some reason, didn't learn it because they set philosophy, a strange philosophy that was very frozen in place on top of this. So they could never recover from it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And China has a different way and has found a different way, amazingly, right? And I attribute this, and I'm curious on your thoughts, the rise of China, and especially the economic rise, maybe it's a bit like the Soviet Union. We don't see what actually is going on in China. That's possible. I mean, I went to China. I'm not sure I found much out. It kind of looks like anywhere else in Asia, to be honest. But it probably exists because the US is less competitive. We don't have this, we don't form ourselves against something else. We kind of took ourselves out of the competition. We are like this extreme marathon runner who says, okay, I won all the contests and I'm done, I retire. And I feel like we're slowly coming out of retirement now.
Yeah, I think that China is really unique in a lot of ways. For example, the Soviet Union was very proud of its multinational composition, and even though the great Russians dominated it, there was room for Ukrainians like Khrushchev. There was room for people from Central Asia. One of the reasons for the breakup of the Soviet Union was that the constituent republics had the right to declare independence. So it was in principle an extremely democratic constitution. But the difference, I think, is that China has become a superpower with minimal import of foreign talent, except for ethnic Chinese who have been educated elsewhere, and it is really very, very openly devoted to creating a single Chinese identity, the kind of an opposite of any kind of federalism or diversity, and that has a lot of positive features for China, because I think that people especially given the ruthless exploitation of China and oppression of China in the 19th and 20th centuries, people have a well-grounded reason to assert national pride. Except you can take any good thing too far. But the other really interesting thing about China is the way in which it can combine Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy with a flourishing but tamed and supervised private sector. So it's given up that kind of central planning of the Soviet 5-year plans. The new 5-year plan is really, even the Chinese word has changed. I read it's more like guidelines. It's really no longer we're allocating so much for this and so much for that. It's like here is what we really want to do as a society. So it has been incredibly successful, and I'm not one to predict anything about its future. However, I should say on a personal note that for my last book, The Efficiency Paradox, the only translation we have sold so far is into Chinese, and it's just appeared in Shanghai. And it was actually it was a decent amount. So I have. I have a lot of positive things to say about China based on my own experience. On the other hand, I'm wondering how long China can continue its rise. For example, if even members of the elite outside the party don't have access to major Western publications. I was at a dinner at a club in New York, and my host was a professor of social science, and his guest was one of the leading social scientists of China. And this man said that in China, even he, a professor at a major university, does not have access to the New York Times, for example. So how can a country hope to dominate if even members of its own elite are not really free to examine ideas from outside?
Yeah.
And I don't know how they're going to deal with that.
It won't, almost by definition, but it takes a long time, right, until this materializes, this weakness. Once you move away from the truth, and I think China has been doing this for quite some time, and you eventually pay a price. That might be another 10, 20, 30 years, but the day is coming, and there's a bunch of books. Peter Zehan writes about that. Here's a very interesting thesis from a geopolitical standpoint, what will happen to, the war on, it doesn't have to be a hot war, but the conflict of the big geopolitical powers in the next 20 years. Mm-hmm. One thing I wanted to ask you, going into a slightly different topic, a lot of people say that technology itself has like an agenda. So it seems to as much change us as we appreciate these new innovations. People sometimes describe it, not scientific, describe this to, say, an alien technology that wants us to build spare parts. As someone gave us all this sudden consciousness, we made all these big developments, relatively small time frame, and we have all these. It seems to go some places. We can say, well, it's just randomness, but maybe technology is leading us somewhere. Have you ever had this impression?
I don't favor that view. And the reason I don't is that it doesn't look at all the directions technology could have gone in. In other words, things look inevitable, but actually they're the result of choices that people, powerful people, corporate leaders, government leaders make in which technology to pursue, which technology not to pursue. So there wasn't for example, the first 5-year plan was in the UK in the 1880s, and it was for the construction of more battleships to meet the challenge of the rise of German naval power. Well, you could say that the battleships had a momentum, that the technology of warfare was evolving by its own logic, and forcing people to follow. But you could also say that this was a cultural thing based on the attitudes of the people who were running Germany, the people who were running Britain, and that the technology could have developed along totally different lines. Another world would be possible where you didn't have naval rivalries, where you had much more international cooperation, where the money could have been invested in other things. So it's true that in some areas, for example, in the development of microcomputers, there was a kind of built-in technological agenda of miniaturization, and it's really been absolutely amazing when you consider the power, the computing power of the iPhone that I'm using now for this interview. You would not have had anything like that in a Cray supercomputer of the 1980s, which needed its own water cooling supply. If people are talking about inflation, but this is a kind of amazing negative inflation, there wouldn't have been any way to make an iPhone at any price in the 1980s. So maybe we are just taking too much for granted the miracles of our own time. I personally am very, very conscious of this, because I lived through that period when people were boasting about these supercomputers, and I think that it's people should really be much more grateful for what they have, and in some ways they could say, well, people think of income as being diminishing, but in some ways, if you think of all the benefits that you can get from a smartphone, our income has been increasing. For example, I often will use a chess program called Stockfish to practice, and Stockfish is really is about as strong as any grandmaster in the world. And here I'm able to use it free. I don't even have to use the web. All the calculations are done on my iPhone, and there are other chess programs, and there are programs that will tutor you. So even though I lose every game, of course, it's a challenge for me to see how long I can last. I've never been able to get it to a draw, and I don't think I ever will be able. But it amuses me to see how I can construct the most apparently impregnable defensive structures, and the program has a kind of can opener that can find a weakness. There is always some little gap there that it knows how to exploit. And even though I'm losing, it's a tremendously amusing thing for me to see how this machine is outsmarting me.
Chess is a very good example. When the first battles between AI and the grandmasters came around, it was described, and it's depending on the algorithm, but eventually the researchers came up with algorithms where other chess players would look at it and say, oh, well, there's an intuition. This isn't just we calculate all the odds. And that's especially now true for AlphaGo. They feel like this machine has an intuition. It kind of knows, without calculating all the different odds, which was initially the strategy, it kind of knows what's happening. Do you feel the same when you play chess yourself? Do you observe the same thing now? And are you worried about this? What will soon happen, right? Machines will, for almost all the problems we can think of, there will be the better solution. There will still be stuff left for us. But
I've thought of that. I've thought of that quite a bit, and I should say that sometimes, like I have seen magic acts called cold reading, where the magician appears to know things about the spectator that clearly involve mind reading. I saw when I was at TED, the last time I was at TED, there was one of these mentalists, and he he found out things about somebody in the audience that nobody there could understand how he was able to know that. Nobody. And yet he did not claim to have magical powers. And there is undoubtedly a rational explanation for his technique. So to me, this effect, of course, who can say whether or not it's real? But it could be that the programs can create a convincing illusion of intuition, which is not the same as having real intuition. And one of the ways that you could sometimes see this is when an AI program makes a mistake, and it makes a mistake that a person would never have made. For example, when the IBM Watson program was on Jeopardy, you know how that works by multiple. Not the way a human being would approach a problem, but there are multiple algorithms that run in parallel and that take a vote. Just as in airplanes, like Airbus, there are multiple guidance systems with different hardware programmed differently with different programming languages that vote, so that it's inevitable that there's a glitch in one program or the other. But it is almost impossible that the same glitch will occur simultaneously in 3 or 4 different programs at the same point.
Boeing must have used a different system.
Well, that's another question. So they did use a different system actually. So the one of the questions though about the location of airports in Canada was something that you could kind of know by minimal geographic knowledge and common sense. It was one of the easiest questions, and yet Watson failed that one and succeeded with its massive databases with more complicated ones. So I am still in the skeptical category about certain things about AI, although I don't doubt that there are many others that will really astound us. But I don't think we should believe that just because it does some things astoundingly well, that it can necessarily do everything astoundingly well.
Yeah, well, that famous quip, someone said, whenever we can't explain something, we think it's magic or it's God. That seems to be the only things that fit in there. And we certainly over attribute this all the time. But the funny part with all this AI is we don't really know why it works. I mean, the original model, nobody really knows why it works. We know there's statistics involved, but none of the researchers knows, and so the model can't talk to us. Nobody can say, okay, this is why it works.
That's right.
This body of why answers, right? Nowadays we can go to a human, and more or less the human will be pressed to come up with a why answer, or you will be able to fund your research, right?
Yes.
Or you will don't get the human recognition. For machines, it will never be a problem. And then when we go back to intentions, right, where we say, okay, we believe you have a good intention, so I believe you, or bad intention, but I still think it will work out. With machines, we can never do this, right? They just they kind of plot these things out. We take it and we're happy about it. That's great. But we can never double check the intentions or the why problems. Isn't that worrisome?
Yeah. Well, I think that part of machine learning is this like pattern matching through repeated efforts, and I think it would be hard, for example, for a machine, an AI that was learning how to distinguish dogs from cats, to explain what is there that is like diagnostic for being a cat rather than a dog. It just has kind of created some rules for dogginess and cattiness, and they're extremely they work extremely well. Now, what the big issue, of course, is that the Western idea of science, as you know, is really one that is based on transparency, and it's based on the ability to explain just how something works. Now, there have been exceptions. For example, Newton's breakthrough in the theory of gravity was that he abandoned these metaphysical ideas about what was happening, and he said, look, he said, I don't make hypotheses. That is, I don't construct these grand schemes that other philosophers have done, but I can tell you that bodies obey these laws, and the laws can be expressed mathematically, and that's it. We can't. So, excuse me. So in a lot of ways, Newton's revolution was a kind of modesty in not trying to understand ultimate causes, and maybe sometimes AI is working like that.
Yeah, so it's more modest. That's interesting. I never looked at it that way. That's very interesting. A lot of people, I don't know if you ever looked into this, it is very specific. The principles of flight are apparently not fully understood. Yes, we know there's a certain pressure system, but there seem to be a lot of open questions that many physicists don't have an answer for. I don't actually. I saw that. That's an article I saw, and I'm like, whoa, that's 100 years later.
I'd like the reference to that, and it reminds me of the excuse me, I have a slightly sore throat.
No problem.
It reminds me of what I once read. I was reading about friction and how long it took for physicists to understand friction, and it was also there were many other familiar things in everyday life that were understood only long after people were able to calculate the movement of the planets and galaxies, that some very obvious everyday things turn out to be extremely difficult to explain when you look at them in detail. And I've read that about flight, so I'm interested in a reference to that. But every once in a while we read about other things that have been familiar, generally accepted, and in the textbooks, and then somebody does some more experimental work, and he says, "Hey, wait a minute! This is not what we were planning." And that's one of the things I really love about science, that it is always open to these surprises, and that there are so many opportunities for creative researchers to challenge even ideas that were once apparently so solid. I think that is the best kind of unintended consequences. But I should also mention something that I read about scientific research, that the researcher, for example, in the studies of subatomic particles in accelerators, the researcher is hoping for, not for confirmation of an existing theory, but for some big surprise. But the people who fund the research want the research to prove something. So there is a tension between the sponsor and the investigator.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because a lot of current science, you basically have to exactly predict what you're doing, and then it's funded in milestones. And then if it doesn't go along, you're in trouble, because the next milestone won't come around, because you didn't find what you were looking for. And you can't actually tell people, well, I'm just going to play around with this collider for a year and see what happens, which is probably the better approach in many instances, if you have these open problems.
Exactly. When I was a science editor, I spoke with a geophysicist at a major Western university, and he had written something that I thought would be the basis of a really really good book, and he agreed he would like to work on this, but he said that he wasn't able to because he had to think of his graduate students. So here was somebody who was, I think he was in his 40s. He had tenure. He had a major lab, and one of the unintended consequences of the system was that he had been so successful in getting funding for his lab and attracting graduate students and postdocs that now he was a prisoner of his own success. And so, even though somebody in that position might believe that they have really discovered most of what was to be discovered, and they've reached a point of diminishing returns, it is very hard for them to switch. This is something that I'm working on now as part of my project on time horizons in everyday life. That there is something like a natural rhythm of learning how to do something and then taking it to the highest level you can, and then sustaining it at a high plateau for a few years. But afterwards, there is a fallout. It's like a mine where you have a mother lode, and you can keep mining it and mining it, and the ore gets lower and lower grade. But meanwhile, you have this mine, and so you have to keep crushing the ore and extracting less and less from it. So I think it's become harder for people to break out of that and to shift their interest to a new side of their discipline. But I've spoken with 3 or 4 colleagues and friends of mine in academic life in the humanities as well as the sciences and social sciences, and they all describe experiences like that they had an idea, they pursued it, but then after some time, it was time to move on. But in moving on, you're not going to something entirely new. What you're doing is you're taking ideas and concepts that you developed in your previous phase and you're carrying them forward, so they form a kind of new endowment for you in
Yeah.
the new phase of your research.
Do you think we will see, maybe if we change some of these patterns or there's some new paradigm coming along, we will see another Cambrian explosion of knowledge in the next 20 to 30 years? Do you feel we are just at this cusp, or it's just going to be very similar to what we've seen the last 50 years?
There is an economic historian that I know, Joel Mokyr, who was writing about the idea that we have picked the low-hanging fruit of
Yeah,
science and
exactly.
technology.
Yeah.
And he said that with the new tools that we're developing, we can build taller ladders.
Yeah.
And I really like that metaphor. In other words, when you see the instruments that are available to scientists now, I'm just thinking in genetic sequencing and how quickly we were able to develop vaccines. So what gives me hope is that the instruments that are being developed now will let us answer all kinds of questions that we couldn't have dreamed of answering before. The downside of that, though, is that sometimes, although sometimes the equipment becomes much more democratic and the price is lowered, very often at the frontier, you need exponentially more in order to get to the next phase. So the next super collider is going to be much more expensive than the last one, and ultimately you might need a super collider half the size of the solar system to
Yeah.
to study the next phase.
Do you think we need, and we talked about that earlier a little bit, we should come together and kind of have a new Manhattan Project? There is these, and maybe those are just the winners. So obviously we have to be careful. But we are in the business of printing trillions of dollars right now. Maybe we should just take a few billion, 100 billion, and throw it at something where we really don't know the outcome, but it's big enough. If it works, it's going to change the face of this planet to the better.
Mm-hmm. Well, I haven't yet seen any project that I would put in that category. Although in principle I agree with you. I think we should look out for long shots with incredible benefits. But
The space elevator or
it takes,
fusion,
yeah,
right? Those
yeah,
would be
yeah.
candidates.
This fusion, now fusion is a local specialty here at Princeton. I know
Yeah.
friends at the plasma physics lab. So fusion is one of those things though that people have been dismissing for a long time, but that could suddenly come to the forefront. And maybe fusion is one of those fields in which we should be be putting even more money. Certainly, the people at the plasma physics laboratory in Princeton could make a good case for that. They're right down the road from me, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exciting. Do you get the chance to like hang out with them and see what they are?
I have, yes,
if
I
they make
visited there.
progress?
Yeah. I knew. I know Rush Holt, who was the congressman. He was a physicist there, and he ran for Congress. His family had been in politics, so I knew Rush, and I've had other friends there. They had a wonderful program, now suspended, called Science on Saturday, and they had all kinds of visiting speakers for high school students mainly, but also for members of the community who were talking about their research. That's where I heard the founder of the Watson Project speak. Excuse me.
I think that's all I had, Edward.
Well,
Thanks
thank
for
you. I've enjoyed this. Really, please send me the references.
me too. Thanks for coming on the podcast. It was awesome. I really enjoyed it
Thank you.
tremendously.
It was great. You asked wonderful questions. I wish I had better answers, but those were the best. Those were the best I could
We'll
think
do it
of.
again in 2 years, and I'm sure you have way more answers than I have questions.
Well, I'll be looking forward to that. So thank you very
Same
very
here.
much.
Same here, Edward. Thanks a
Bye-bye.
lot. Really appreciate it.
Bye.
Take it easy. Bye bye.